Hi everyone, it's Rabbi Dr. Jack Cohen. I'd like to speak today on what the land of Israel means to us. The Torah tells us that when Yaakov was running away from Esav, first of all, while he was in Israel, angels were there escorting him, but they left him when he crossed over outside the border and to go into the part that was not Israel any longer. So we see the power of the land, but then he falls asleep at the very same spot where Abraham was to sacrifice Yitzchak at the Akedah, which is the place where the Beis HaMikdash is today. And he goes to sleep and he has a dream, and it says, Vayira vayomar, when he woke up he was frightened. Manorah makom hazeh, how awesome is this place? And Zekim Bet Elokim, this is none other than the house of God. V'zeh Sha'ar Shemaim, and this place which I'm sleeping on is literally the portal, the gateway to heaven. He came to the realization that this was a spot which was not just your typical land, this was holy land. This was a very special place to pray, a very special place. It was sanctified land. It was sanctified ground, that very spot where he was at. Which leads me to an incredible story that I saw, and I need to share this with you to understand what it means to be next to God's house and to sleep in the area where God's house was built. You know, at the early part of the century, in the 1920s, the British overthrew the Ottoman Empire. There were battles between the British and the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, which was the Turkish Empire, was decaying, was losing its hold on many of its countries where it had tremendous prestige and where it had led and maintained rule and order. But now their empire was coming apart, and the British military conquest were able to triumphantly beat them in military victories throughout the world. And one spot was none other than the land of Israel. And so the British took over running the land, and they installed in there a new commissioner called Herbert Samuels. By the way, there is a hotel, the Herbert Samuel Hotel, which is located right there on the corner of Yafo and Ben Yehuda Street. A great hotel, by the way, that I once had the privilege to stay in. So the High Commissioner, who was called Mr. Herbert Samuels, by the way, was a traditional Jew himself. One of his first acts was to meet with all the leaders of all the various religions of the city in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem. So with pomp and circumstances and ceremony, he was greeted by the head of the Greek Orthodox Church in his personal home. He had an estate, he had a mansion. He was greeted by the head of the Russian Orthodox Church in his mansion. He was greeted by the head Muslim cleric, who himself was a rabid anti-Semite, in his mansion. And now it was time for the High Commissioner, the British High Commissioner, to meet with the head of the Jewish community, Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld. Now, unlike the other leaders of the other religions, he did not possess a mansion, not even close. Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld lived in a little hovel, a small dank apartment, somewhat like a basement apartment, near the Chorba Shul in the Old City. And they were really concerned, the leaders of the Jewish community, because they said, here comes a very important, prestigious British official. He's going to be running Jerusalem. And we feel that it'll be very embarrassing for him to come and step into the rabbi's house, which was a hovel, it was a basement, it was dank, dark, damp, and smelly. And he came with a committee to approach the rabbi and said, "Dear honored rabbi, can you help us out?" He says, "What is that?" "You know, you have an audience coming up with the High Commissioner, the British Commissioner, and he's in a position to help us. And many Jews were destitute, and they needed food, they needed clothing and shelter." Said, "You know what, it'd be dishonorable to have the High Commissioner meet with you in your house, which is in a basement, which has poor lighting, which is damp, which is cold, and has no windows. Is it possible for the rabbi to agree to trade apartments just for the meeting, to go upstairs to one of the top apartments of another neighbor? We've secured permission for that. Would you please agree to that so it wouldn't be embarrassing to you and to the High Commissioner?" The rabbi looked at me and says, "I didn't invite him. He wanted to speak with me. So why should I do that?" He says, "No, I'm going to stay the course and remain where I am." And so the famous day came where the British High Commissioner, Mr. Herbert Samuel, was now coming into the Old City to meet with the rabbi. That morning, all the Jews were on edge. What's going to be? How's he going to react to the rabbi's very simple apartment? And so the time came, and the British officer came, and he, like all other military symbolic gestures, he came with a whole entourage and officers decorated with fancy uniforms. And as they approached the rabbi's apartment, the High Commissioner had to bend down to go into his apartment. He looked around, he was aghast at the lodgings that the rabbi lived in. He goes, "Wow, you live here? It's so simple, it's so archaic. I would have assumed that you would have lived in a mansion like the other heads of the other religions. Rabbi, why don't you live in a better place?" So the rabbi looked at him and he said, "I have one window. I want to show you the window." And he took him over to the kitchen. We had a small little window. And he says, "You see over there? That's God's house. God's house where he used to live. That was the place where the great temple stood, the Beis HaMikdash. Once upon a time, it stood with all its majesty and its glory. Today, it lies in ruins. People urinate there. People go to the bathroom. Kids play soccer there. I should have a better house than God's house. God's house, which lays in ruins, is right 100 feet away from me. And you're asking me to live in a better house? I don't deserve any better than God. I worry about God. I think about God. I think about his pain that he doesn't have his own house. Until God gets a house which would be deserving of his royalty and majesty, I shouldn't even think about my own house. And the High Commissioner stood his ground and said, Rabbi, I get it. And he walked away. And he realized that Yosef Chaim Zalnov was teaching us a lesson. We have to worry about God's honor. We have to worry about God's sanctity. We have to worry about God's reputation, not what we live in and what we're concerned with. And we see here the power of Israel is enormous. And our job and mission is to try to get as connected as possible to the land, to visit the land, and to hope to aspire that one day we can live there quickly with the coming of Mashiach. Amen. Thank you.